Namaste. Amen, and blessed be. As we close our month of focusing on authority, I wanted to talk a little bit this week about the power that each one of us has in our lives. Every one of you has authority, whether you think about it or not. So I want to invite us to think about the authority that we do have and how we're called to exercise it. Now, instead of offering an answer, often my sermons are the beginning of a conversation as I invite you to question with me. And today, that's just what I hope to do. I hope to invite you into thinking about the authority that each of us has and how we use it. We're not coming up with an exact answer today. We're just beginning to ask the question. Now, authority is something that most ministers have dedicated a significant amount of thought to. It's one of the central questions that you have to be able to answer in preparing in seminary, because it's a question on some of those interviews. But more importantly, it's pretty necessary to feel any sense of confidence in the role. Ministers have to answer this question of ministerial authority. Now, for me, authority comes in a few different forms. Most simply, I've studied and earned a Master's of Divinity, a degree that our tradition requires for ordination, and I learned this body of knowledge to execute a job. I've also executed the steps required by our tradition, by the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, and the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. Lots of hoops, let me tell you. Those include having a master's degree, successfully completing a year of internship, and passing a series of pretty arduous interviews. But those are the pretty simple logistical answers to the question of authority. The much more nuanced and interesting sources involve relationship. In our tradition, only a congregation can ordain a minister. Only a community can convey that trust and responsibility. And similarly, in selecting a settled minister, the entire congregation votes on whether or not to call a particular minister. Now, some of you are pretty new here. Some of you are even visiting. So just to share part of our history, it was just spring of 2013 that the members of Tapestry voted to invite me to minister to this community. It was a big day for all of us. Now, other sources of authority come from personal introspection and spiritual practice, an interest in leadership, and a commitment to justice for a community far beyond Unitarian Universalism. So a whole network of things come together to create authority. Some of them are legitimately earned. Other pieces of authority, though, both mine and yours, are unearned. For whatever reason, some pieces of authority are simply given to us. When thinking of unearned authority and religious leadership, I'm reminded of the tremendous financial expense of education and internship for the ministry. I did incur some student debt, and I probably could have eventually made it on my own, but my ability to shoot straight through college and graduate school without pausing to raise the money myself means that a huge chunk of my authority was given to me by the support of my family. It's not something that I personally earned. Now, I don't feel guilty about that, but I don't feel great about it either. Remember, this is a conversation starter, not an answer. Some of the authority that I have and that each of you have was simply given to us by chance. Now, ministerial authority is just one type of authority. It's a little easier to identify because it comes with a uniform and a few extra letters before my name and a very long cultural history. But there are many, many other forms of authority that every single one of us fills an authority role somewhere. You have power somewhere in your life, maybe as a parent. Some of you are elders to this community and elders to your own family. Some of you supervise other people in the workplace. If you have a job at all, you're given authority to execute some particular task, big or small. As citizens of the United States, we are given authority and responsibility for voting. You may have some sense of authority in your neighborhood, and some of you, at least our board members here at Tapestry, and I'm sure a handful of other people, are holding elected positions of some sort. People have voted for you to represent them. So think with me for just a moment, what are all the venues in your life where you exercise authority? Where do you have power to act or to make your voice heard? It's probably more than you thought of when you got up this morning. Now, Unitarian Universalists tend to be a little skeptical of authority. You probably heard that in our introductions all month long. But authority isn't necessarily a bad thing. Leadership is not an inherently bad thing. In fact, we name the democratic process as one of our key ideals in the 7 principles. It says that we affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and society at large. Democracy isn't just a means to limit power from dictatorship. It's a means to organize a community and to create leadership. Democracy is a method of empowering leaders, giving them authority to act in our best interest. And it's a beautiful thing. Now, wrapping ourselves in the American flag and being the best country on earth isn't what I'm talking about, and that's not particularly helpful. There are a lot of democratic countries out there, and I'll be the first to admit that the majority opinion has caused plenty of mess here in the United States. Remember, in most places, same-sex marriage here is still only legal because of the power of the court, not the ballot box. As we talk about democracy, particularly as a goal of our faith tradition, we remember that it's not simply a set of rules that we praise. It's a lot more complicated than every person getting one vote. It's an ideal, ever beyond our grasp. It's something that we'll always strive for, by means that sometimes don't look anything like a voting booth or even mainstream political activities. On Monday, this past Monday, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I participated in a march with about 200 other people in Anaheim. A few other folks from Tapestry were there as well. And it was a powerful event, not just by the numbers of people, but the energy among us. As we marched from the Anaheim UU congregation to the City Hall in Anaheim, we participated in several chants as we went down the street with our signs. One in particular still resonates in my head. In this chant, the leader would say, "Show me what democracy looks like." And everyone else would respond, "This is what democracy looks like." And the leader would say, "Show me what the people look like." And everyone would say, "This is what the people look like." Show me what democracy looks like. Show me what the people look like. Well, it looks like 200 people marching down the street without a police escort because they didn't show up. It looks like a multi-generational exercise of free speech with children, youth, adults, and elders in solidarity. Democracy looks like a gathering of Unitarian Universalists, Muslims, Black church leaders, Latino youth, American Indians, and a tapestry that is far too vivid and rich to describe here. Together, refusing to accept police brutality in Orange County. This is what democracy looks like. This is what building legitimate authority looks like. I had a pretty thorough experience of Martin Luther King holiday between hearing Angela Jansen speak here last week about her experiences in Ferguson, Missouri, and then that night I went to watch the movie Selma, and the next day, on Monday, I went to this march. It was a pretty amazing MLK couple of days. How many of you have seen this movie Selma? Ooh, not enough. So I'm going to summon whatever authority I have as a minister and tell you, go see it. It's a really sincerely powerful film. It's actually emotionally exhausting. Be prepared to come out after pretty exhausted. Even with a couple of historical inaccuracies that I've heard of, it's really worth seeing. And I would go to the theater to sit with other people. It's very different from seeing it at home alone. Now, one of the subplots of the movie is the story of a white minister from Boston. And I'm sorry to give away this small subplot, but I have to. This white minister from Boston was murdered on the streets of Selma after dinner one night. What the movie didn't tell you was that that minister, James Reeb, was a Unitarian. There are far too many layers of history and personal stories in Selma for the movie to explore them all, but it did nod to a couple of the really important ones. But I want to tell you a little more about Reverend James Reeb because he has a lot to teach us about authority, particularly as Unitarians. As I mentioned before, he was a white Unitarian minister. Prior to coming to Selma, his ministry was really deeply rooted in community development and building bridges with the African American community in Washington, D.C., and in Boston. When Dr. King called for clergy to join the efforts in Selma, Reed came immediately. He left his wife behind with 4 children in Boston, where they had struggled to make ends meet. He knew, and his wife knew, that this undertaking was dangerous. Now, the murder of James Reeb was horrible. For Unitarian Universalists, he's sort of our modern martyr. His story is really worth understanding. In fact, I have a book about his story if anyone wants to borrow it. It's the ministry leading up to his death that's the compelling piece. We hold him up as a martyr. Following his death, white clergy from around the country swarmed to Selma. The media regularly gave updates about his status, and the president personally met his widow. Through a series of rallies, funds were raised to support his family. It's a powerful story. As a white Unitarian minister, James Reeb had great authority in the world, and this is where the story gets complicated. The sacrifice that he made was tremendous, but it was no more tremendous than the sacrifice of Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American activist murdered that same week. It was no more greater sacrifice than Andrew Goodman, a Jewish civil rights activist murdered in that same year, or Viola Liuzzo, a white female Unitarian civil rights activist murdered that same year. Because of the position he held and the color of his skin, the murder of James Reeb caught our attention. It invites some soul searching for our Unitarian Universalist movement. Why did it take the death of one of our ministers, one of our people with authority, to call us into action? I don't have an answer for you today, but I want to invite us to sit with the question. As I said earlier, everyone has authority in some area of life, but most of us in this room have a lot of authority, to be honest. As I've thought more about authority this week, probably more than I ever have, I've come to realize that ignoring our own authority is almost as dangerous as using it for ill. We don't often embrace the practice of confession as Unitarian Universalists, but confession is good for the soul. So I want to make a confession. It's that I have a couple of friends, guys that I hang out with on a regular basis, that make really inappropriate jokes about race. They mimic accents and make up dialogue that they think someone we encounter might say. They're stereotypes based on racial appearance of strangers. Now, they're not wearing bed sheets or burning crosses in people's yards, but they're making some pretty awful comments. Now, the confession that I want to make isn't so much that they're my friends. The confession that I want to make is that I haven't asked them to stop. I've known these guys for a few years. I've foolishly thought that my very obvious lack of laughter would be enough of a message, but it hasn't been. I make this confession because it brings it to this community, a place where I can draw courage and strength. I make a confession to prepare myself to do something different, to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. Now, I know I'm not alone in this. Speaking out in Orange County can be difficult. We feel like the progressive voice is a minority opinion here in Orange County. And it is, at least in South Orange County. But I have the authority to do something different. Most of us in this room have a great deal of authority to speak up. And then the next time that the sense of fear comes on, the next time we worry about offending our friends or being dismissed as the kooky liberal or being no fun, let us remember that we actually have power in this world. Most of the time, we have more power than the people that those jokes are being made about. We have authority, and sometimes we're called to use it. Now, I want to close today's sermon with a quote from Leela Watson. She's an Indigenous Australian activist, and you've probably heard this before. She said, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting our time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Now, understanding our authority and exercising it isn't just about helping other people. When we understand our authority and we use it to correct injustice, we tend to our own liberation as well, regardless of the issue. Our liberation is bound up together. Our salvation is universal salvation. No one goes alone on this journey. Injustices affect not just the disenfranchised, but those in authority as well. White people are impacted by racism. Men are impacted by sexism. Straight people are impacted by homophobia, and so on and so on. That's because each one of those isms depends on shaming everyone involved into participating. While those without power are shamed into thinking less of themselves, those with power are shamed into limiting their compassion for other human beings. Now, this sermon has been largely focused on race. That's just because we're on the heels of MLK Day and national events. But I hope you hear the understanding that using authority has a much broader application. It isn't just about race. It isn't even just about political change. It's about knowing that power shapes our relationships. From the voting booth to the conference room, from the classroom to the dinner table, power matters. And when we have authority, it's our responsibility to use it for what it is and to use it with great care, because our liberation is bound up together. Amen.